numbers times intensity. We all know that intensity of people's passion for these things makes a huge difference. It isn't just numbers, but both. And I wanted to suggest another thing is that the false fear here is about time. You know, the basic argument that all the Transcat is making is about time. There's not time, right? I'm going to talk about some of that in my presentation. But the issue about time, I think the way you should think about lobbying is also about the intensity. I want you to think about this, is we will lobby you forever. Because they need to know you're not going to go away. This special session is one event, but there will be future opportunities, and there are things that can be done. You know, heaven forbid this gets permitted. There are things you can do afterwards. But if you go in there and there's a sense that you should deal with us because we're going to lobby you forever, you know, deal with it. Otherwise, if they think they can stall and hide and, you know, play false fears about things all over the place, then they will do that. Anyway. Okay, well, again, my name is Paul Blackburn. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, some of it's kind of technical and some of it's a little bit obscure, but, you know, if you hear particular things of interest to you, just jot it down, jot down my number, call Boulder, Nebraska if you need to talk to me or the Sierra Club. You know, don't try to gather all this stuff, but if there's particular pieces that spark your thoughts and you want to remember, you know, jot it down and we can always get back to you later. This can't cover everything in this presentation. Alrighty? I always put this up just so people can see it. This is really two pipelines, the Keystone XL pipeline and the first Keystone pipeline. They both built it in 4 different phases, but you know, there's basically the 36-inch pipeline and a 30-inch pipeline. And next slide. They say there's a federal regulatory structure, and I use the put in quotations because it's extremely loose and it's actually quite limited. There's the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, Pipeline Safety Act, and they regulate pipeline safety. Talk about them. The Department of State handles the permit at the border, and only at the border. The Federal Regulatory Commission approves how much it costs to use the pipeline, and then there are a bunch of other agencies that do smaller things, but there's no comprehensive scheme. So next slide. PHMSA regulates pipeline safety, but that doesn't mean that everything related to safety is managed by PHMSA. For example, and PHMSA just deals with the pipeline itself and the pipeline company itself, but the things that are not related to emergency response, all the emergency response equipment and how much planning they have to do and all that sort of thing is regulated by Clean Water Act. It's not regulated by PHMSA. Control of new development of adjacent landowners. If you don't want to build a hospital right next to a big, huge oil pipeline, for example. Easement termination and abandonment, liability standards, and of course, routing. And next slide. We're going to talk about each of these in turn. I'd like you to think about PHMSA as a building inspector. Does a building inspector go put out fires? No, the fire department puts out fires. Does a building inspector determine if a particular building or use is appropriately sited? No, the zoning department does, or somebody like that. Does a building inspector condemn easement, condemn property or deal with easements? No. Do they deal with liability? No. They deal with the equivalent of the wires and whether your door is wide enough and, what kind of plumbing you have and that sort of stuff. So PHMSA is a building inspector. It's the easiest way to think about it. The Pipeline Safety Act is a building code. So as long as states don't try to act as building inspectors, then states can do a lot with safety. Next slide. The president, as much as made about the president's authority on this, the president has authority under the Constitution to cite the location of the border crossing and how much oil comes in and the size of the pipeline. And that is all that the president can do under his independent constitutional authority. The president's authority within the borders of the United States has to be defined by statute, and this sort of broad national interest thing is not a part of his authority within the United States. And also you hear about, that they'll argue about NEPA. Well, they did all this evaluation, the routes and, different terms and conditions and NEPA and suggestions for improvements. NEPA is just strictly a study it statute, unfortunately. It doesn't include any authority to take any of the actions suggested by the environmental impact statement. So for example, they studied drought throughout the United States. There's not a single federal agency that can determine the route of that pipeline in the United States. So when someone asks, why in the world did you study an issue that nobody could order TransCanada to do anything about? Now in Montana, where they have a routing statute, then they can change the route. But every place from Nebraska south, you can study the route all you want, alternative routes and this and that or whatever. So what? Nobody can tell them to move it. In Nebraska, Oklahoma, in Kansas, Texas. So it's pretty much a window dressing thing. The U.S. can't impose any mitigation standards. They can't change the safety requirements, and they can't pick groundwater. And don't you think it's odd that the Department of State is managing an environmental review in Nebraska? I mean, this is the group that deals with foreign affairs and the Palestine, and the Middle Eastern issues and all that, and here they are dealing with an environmental issue in Nebraska. It's very interesting. Anyway, next slide. FERC I only bring up because they determine how much it costs to use this pipeline, who pays what for what. And there's a lot of important things about what FERC does, but I can't go into it all right now. But it is important to understand that if this is a interstate natural gas pipeline, FERC would be a one-stop shop for the permitting. So if this is an interstate natural gas pipeline, you all would know where to go to talk about route, and determine route. You would all know to go talk about avoiding environmentally sensitive issues. FERC can order them to avoid environmentally sensitive locations or concerns. You would know where to go to ask for improved soil management in the construction. FERC can order that. For natural gas pipelines, it may not be a perfect system, but it isn't so freaking confusing as what's been set up for oil pipelines. So anyway, that's just a little comparison and contrast for that. And then other federal agencies, I'm not going to go through these, but this is just to show you that other agencies do things, but they're all pretty much, small potato stuff. I mean, it can be important for individual people, but doesn't rise to the level of a full permitting, process. And the 10th Amendment, I put this in there, it's in the Constitution anyway, but they added this sort of as an emphasis in the Constitution, that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited by the states, to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. In other words, if the feds don't do it, then the states or local governments can. You don't want regulatory gaps. In a lot of ways with the arguments we hear say, well, the state can't do it, but the feds aren't going to do it, so nobody can regulate us. Well, guess what? The courts recognize that when there's what's called a regulatory gap, where somebody's arguing that, well, nobody should be able to regulate this industry in any way, in this particular issue, the courts look in disfavor with that kind of argument, that kind of result. Next. So here are a list of the kinds of things that the state can do. And again, we're going to go through these quickly, so if you hear about something that piques your interest, just jot it down and take my phone number or email or contact all the Nebraskans here. Again, generally speaking, states can't regulate pipeline safety. They can't act like they can't change the size of the kind of steel in the pipe. They can't change how it's welded. They can't change any of the safety requirements around its construction or operation. So states can't do that. But what's called siting or construction permit, and that's things like mitigation for construction damage. So somebody's talking about the soil being damaged in the first Keystone Pipeline. There are, like South Dakota, where I was working and represented landowners there in the PUC hearing, and there's a lot of testimony and a lot of discussion about how to not construct during wet weather, how to segregate soils properly, how to rip the land after it's been doing to make sure it's aerated and loosened up. There's a lot of technical soil science about recovering land that's been damaged from construction. And that's the kind of thing that this permit would do. Even a more interesting thing, there are a bunch of landowners in South Dakota that had fossils on their land. And you think, well, so what? Well, the most valuable fossil pulled out of this land was a T-Rex fossil worth $9 million. It was going through the Hell Street Formation where these fossils were found, and the landowners didn't want these. If they ran into one of these fossils, they didn't want it to be bulldozed, and hidden from them. They wanted be able to, collect that fossil. And we went back and forth, and ultimately TransCanada is now responsible for paying to excavate those fossils and properly care for them. And that could be, for a landowner that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars of expense at the last, just without any warning. Now TransCanada is responsible. So there are a lot of things that a state can do to limit the damage of a construction process. Routing. Lots and lots about routing has gone on. It's clear that states have authority to route. Minnesota, North Dakota, Montana all route pipelines. There is an open question, and I'll get to this later about that. But emergency response planning, anything to do with emergency response planning is not preempted. It's all under the Clean Water Act. States can do whatever they want in terms of emergency response planning, equipment requirements, training, preparation, anything related to emergency response planning is fair game to any degree. Eminent domain, easement, abandonment, liability for spills, regulation of neighboring land uses, and taxation. We'll get to these each of these in turn. Next slide. So I already talked about some of these things, but I just want you to look through, list these, and I'm doing this because even though it's kind of boring, for some of you in the audience, particular things here may actually, tweak some thought in your mind that my property has that issue. And this is only a partial list of what the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission did to protect landowners. So, appointment of a public liaison officer to handle citizen complaints. When TransCanada was in the first pipeline, was busy ignoring people and disregarding their concerns. People came back for the second hearings for the Keystone XL and said, yeah, they said they're going to do this, but they didn't. So we want you to have somebody, that we can go to and raise complaints, and that person can go to the commission then and say that they're not following the rules, that TransCanada is not following the rules. So it provides sort of an ombudsperson for the landowners to go to, a conduit of communications. The mitigation plan in the FEIS, this is all the recovery of soils and shelter belts and water and wetlands and everything else. That plan's in the EIS. I mean, there's no federal agency that can enforce it, but it's there. But the state of South Dakota adopted it as a state requirement. So now it is actually a binding requirement. And Nebraska could do the same thing. Detailed requirements of soil and vegetation reclamation after construction. I talked about that somewhat. I mean, that includes everything from the kinds of plantings you do to the way the soil is treated. Different kinds of soils require different treatments. There's a lot of discussion about what kind of federal scientists to bring in from the different, conservation services. There's a lot of things about soil that farmers care a lot about. I mean, it's the bedrock of their lives. Limitation of construction activity during wet conditions. Constructing during wet conditions on land is it can really impact the land and is very bad for it. So in South Dakota, they had quite strict rules about when they could construct and when they couldn't construct. And here I would guess that it's kind of a whenever. And there's probably no rules about that in Nebraska. Shelter belts and trees, construction through water bodies or riparian areas. This includes stock ponds. If they're going to go through a stock pond, how can they keep some of that water available for the stock that's there? If it's a dry summer, it's really important for the farmers to be able to water their stock. Road protection, they really tear the roads up when they build these things. And having, solid terms in there about what they have to do to repair the roads and when and how fast. They also require that the High Plains Aquifer be a hydrologically sensitive area, which changes the way it's treated under the federal safety laws. Limitation on noise on pump stations. I don't know if anybody here has got a pump station plan near their house, but they are noisy little buggers, and they can soundproof them, but only if somebody tells them to. And no liability for spills resulting from normal farming practices. Or from the growth negligence, except for growth negligence or misconduct of landowners and its agents. That's important because, the state now, under the permit, says that if a farmer is doing normal farming practices and a piece of equipment hits the pipeline because, for example, the soils are over the top of it, the farmer's not liable. Otherwise, under law, they might be said to be responsible for knowing that pipeline was buried too shallow. If they should have known the regional person wouldn't have been farming there, and with lots of legal arguments that would have shoved it down the farmer's throat, and then the whole spill would have been responsibility of that farmer. So, those are very practical things that can make a difference in people's lives going forward. Next slide. Routing, like I said, North Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, all routing laws. States have full authority to route these pipelines based on economic, aesthetic, and environmental reasons. I mean, you can cite where McDonald's goes in a lot of towns because of zoning permits. Why can't you cite where a pipeline goes? Counties can do this and states can do this.
Is that the reason on the southwest corner of North Dakota, there's a little crook in the pipeline that lets it avoid North Dakota?
Not so much. I think they just didn't want to go through the entire routing process up there for just a short distance. I think if they'd even gone through just a couple of miles, any distance in North Dakota at all, they would have found it gone through an entire year-long permitting process in North Dakota too. And I think they figured by routing around North Dakota, they could avoid the entire permit issue. I think that's what they were doing. But if you think about it, it's common sense that if they wanted to go through a memorial battlefield, you don't think that a state or county government could say, no, you're not going to go through, or a cemetery, a state wilderness area, or away from homes and businesses. If they wanted to run it right down a main street where it would be disrupting parking and businesses for months and months and months, that wouldn't make any sense. So it's kind of common sense that somebody has to be able to site and route these pipelines. I mean, TransCanada tries to avoid a lot of these places, but that's not the point. They don't avoid them all. And it shouldn't be their sole decision about what the trade-offs are. It should be the people's decision about what the trade-offs are for the railroads. And then there's one big exception, one issue about safety that has never been resolved by federal court, and that's whether a state can say, to improve safety, we're going to route the pipeline away from a particular resource or a particular place. And the answer is that the federal courts haven't decided they've never been brought to them whether or not safety could be considered in routing. I think it's an extremely strong argument that the federal law says that PHMSA can't do it, and they did that so that states could. Again, if the states can't consider safety in routing, and the feds can't consider safety in routing, then nobody can. And that's just simply, a regulatory gap that doesn't make any sense. But like I said, when you look at the Sidley and Austin and draft legal memos, they say that you can't consider safety in routing, period. And then a lawyer reads, there's no citation after that period. That means that they're just making that as a bold-faced assertion. And I've done all the research too, and there is not case law on this, so that is an untested issue. And I think there's a very strong argument to say that safety could be considered in routing. And anybody who says that it's been decided by law is simply not saying the truth. Because Sidley and Austin and Graff, if they had found a case or some citation that would prove that point, heaven knows they would have cited it. But they didn't, so it just doesn't exist. Next slide. Emergency response planning. Again, like I said, there's these different acts. The Pipeline Safety Act is the building code. Clean Water Act is it's also called the Oil Pollution Act, part of the Clean Water Act, is the cleanup. Fire department is part of this. And the Clean Water Act says, nothing in this section shall be construed to discriminate any state or political subdivision thereof from imposing any requirement related to a discharge. In other words, states can do whatever they want with regard to cleaning up oil spills. And rather than talk about that a lot, I wanted to go down to this link at the bottom and show you what the state of Washington does. And you'll just go around their website for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and you can see some of what they do. You can see for the state of Washington, for this one contractor, they just simply show you where all the skimmers are, all the booms are, the response vessels, and all their equipment. So, citizens go on there and have some comfort that there's a lot of equipment. And this is just one contractor. And none of this is required to be on the web by federal law. And, this level of equipment isn't there. Plus, the state has its own equipment caches. They have booms and skimmers and other equipment the state has paid for. And those are scattered all around. There's maps of that. You can go on and see the regional response plans. They talk about what would happen if a spill was in a particular river or a particular water body, who would do what, and what would the order be, and citizens can comment on all that. So you can see that there's just a huge amount that can be done. Now, For the first Keystone Pipeline, TransCanada has 3 equipment caches that they own themselves, and one of them is in Yankton. For the entire length of the pipeline, there's 3 places where they stash equipment that they own. One of them is in Yankton, and it consists of one 40-foot trailer and one 20-foot trailer full of stuff. In contrast, you remember Enbridge that spilled in the Kalamazoo River? Yeah, well, it's 20,000 barrels, which is smaller pipeline, lower pressure than the Keystone XL. That, Enbridge has, I believe it's 22, it could be 27 different equipment caches. And they include equipment at the pump stations. Every pump station has an equipment cache. And that actually was important in that spill, because the spill happened right near a pump station, so when Enbridge's employees figured out there was a spill, they could just drive a few miles and go start deploying equipment within minutes. It took them hours to figure out there was a spill, but once they figured out, they could start blocking off the oil from spreading even further than it already had. So, you know, whereas here, TransCanada have to send somebody with a truck to Yankton to haul it down into Nebraska, you know, once they were told, and it would take a long time. But, well, the important thing about time with spills is that as if you're in a creek or river, the longer you wait, the further it spreads downstream. The more people it impacts, the more damage it does, and the more it costs to clean up. If Enbridge hadn't had a lot of equipment fairly near that spill in Kalamazoo, that oil might have hit Lake Michigan and created a real mess. So, you know, TransCanada is really cheaping out what it owns. And it also has a national response contract. It's called National Response Corporation. It's a national contractor that handles spill response for a bunch of different companies, including TransCanada. It spent $112,000 in 2010 to pay for their services. That's for the entire length of that pipeline. $112,000 might sound like something to some people, but that's nothing in terms of equipment. That's just, you know, paying them basically to maintain their website and to, you know, use them. And if something happens, then they'll start mobilizing the resources. And I did a full study on this. You can find on the web. There's very little equipment that they have in Nebraska. They'd be bringing in equipment from Denver, from Chicago, and ultimately from the Gulf Coast and from both coasts. Enbridge, in the spill in Michigan, had to bring in 2,000 employees and hundreds of pieces of heavy equipment to deal with that spill. If there's a spill up near Valentine, where are they going to house 2,000 people? And if it's in the wintertime,
right.
Well, where are they going to put them all? And they've never really, you know, they don't have any public plans about how to really deal with this. You know, their reaction is, we're the oil industry, we'll come in and clean up the mess after it's spread all over the place, and we'll pay you all off, and it'll all be great. Well, you know, Enbridge at this point has spent $700 million in Michigan. They expect to spend $700 million in that spill. But the sad thing is that a lot of people's lives are really messed up by that. People move from their houses, you know, the river has still got oil in it. Bitumen, once the light component goes out, sinks, so it's not like other oil where if you have a spill, you can skim it all off the surface or emulsifies and it all sinks and goes in the bottom of the rivers and creeks and just sits there forever, and so it has to be dredged out. It's a big deal. It's a bitumen spill.
I have a question. While you're going over all this, our bill can't possibly have all this stuff in there, so who makes up these regulations?
Well, that's the thing about time, and I'll get to that a little bit later too, is that not all these things have to be done in this special session or even the next regular session. Spill response, you know, improving the state's spill response can be done anytime in the future.
Well, anything that you brought us here, I mean, you've had a lot of pictures and a lot of things, you know, that the state can do, and it's like, okay, is it supposed to be in the bill? All this stuff you're showing
No, at
us?
this point the bills are pretty closely defined, but like I said, this is sort of for your reference going forward. You know, that the special session is going to be over fairly quickly, and I understand that everybody needs to focus on the bills that are there and improving those. But, you know, they're not going to cover everything. They're not going to give you everything that needs to be done. And, you know, as I said, this has got to be a lobby them forever. You know, that if they don't do spill response now, well, they should do it next year. If they don't do it then, they should do it the year after. There's no time limits on a lot of these things. The only thing that's time sensitive, I think, is the routing, and to a degree the siting and construction permits. But all the rest of these things are not time sensitive. You know, you can do easement improvements, eminent domain improvements, you can do any of the other things we're talking about now or in the future. So it's just important for them to understand that, well, okay, we're not going to deal with this particular issue today, but we're going to be back next year and we're going to talk about it again.
Okay, my other question was, when you talk about what the White House can do, can the president, if it deals only with the border, can he stop it right there at the border and say no?
Yes. That's the whole point of his decision, is whether or not it's in the national interest. So, anyway, getting on the next piece, eminent domain, again, I mean, it'd be great if it could be done, something could be done now, but if it isn't, it can still be improved in the future, and something for landowners to think about. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but it's a fairly technical subject, but there are, there is a difference between taking land for a school or a road or some other truly public project and taking land for an international, transnational oil company. And the law in most states just treats them all the same. And I don't think that's fair. That if they're going to be doing something worse, a company's going to be making hundreds of millions of dollars. Right now, TransCanada's net income is $80 million a quarter. So that's their net income. On the Keystone XL pipeline only, the first Keystone pipeline. So, they can be treated, they should be treated differently than if a school district needs a school or a town needs a new road put through or something like that. They should be more generous because they're going to be making a lot of money. Next slide. Easement and pipeline abandonment. This is a long way in the future. And it's something that, some landowners I think will think about because they have long memories of what the land is and what's going to happen. And their families have been in the land for years. After a pipeline's useful life ends, and TransCanada will say that this pipeline will have an infinite life, that it'll never wear out. And it's true, I had a Toyota Corolla during law school that in theory could have been repaired. It was pretty rusty, but in theory it could have been fixed up, but it just didn't make any economic sense to do so. A 36-inch pipe running through farmland is one heck of a drain. It can move entire lakes in short order. It could change the groundwater massively if it starts to leak. And this is after it's been clubbed, after they've stopped using it and it's empty. If it starts rusting through, it can create sinkholes as dirt goes into it. If the soil erodes, it can create a barrier and be dangerous for traffic, for vehicles, for livestock. A big 36-inch pipe in the ground, it can also stop building a house over it. You'd have to get it removed. And technically, in most states, the steel in the pipe is still owned by the pipeline company, even if the easement is reverted. So a lot of places, landowners can't take the steel out of the ground unless they get permission of the company. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. There's a case down in Texas where a landowner said, please remove this pipe from my land, I want to build a house. And the pipeline company said, this pipe hadn't been used in a decade. The pipeline company said, well, if you pay us $50,000, we'll do a study and decide whether we can or not. It's their pipe, and they were trying to make the landowner do it. Now, Canada had a huge process where they set aside a national fund to pay for pipe remediation, because these pipes, all these pipes are going to wear out at some point, and somebody's got to pay for the repair, for getting those pipes sealed, filled, removed, whatever, but that can be just as expensive as building the damn thing. So TransCanada is going to go through the expense of building it, but they don't want to pay the expense now, what it's going to cost to remove it, or fill it, or take care of it so it's not a danger. And if we can get that cost rolled into this project, that's a big deal. Okay, next slide. Liability for damages.
Going back to that last slide, if the state doesn't have money in a kitty that is the result of revenue either produced by the pipeline or financial resources put up by the pipeline, and you get to the end of the effective life of the pipeline, then that's one issue. But there's also the other issue of corporations come and go.
Yeah.
They go broke. There's a better deal.
There's a reporter. There's a reporter. I can't remember his name. I'll think of it. Out of New York, who did. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who analyzed how pipeline companies got the gut the companies of money before they finally sell the pipes. So what happens is they extract the value of the pipe when it's newer and over time. But as it gets to be old and crotchety, they'll transfer the pipe to some other company that doesn't have deep pockets, it doesn't have a lot of money. And by the time the pipe is decommissioned, usually the company that owns it owns almost no money, has almost no resources. And the pipeline is no longer usable, so it's no longer an asset that can be garnished or lien against or anything. So essentially, they know how to protect themselves from having to pay for this. So ultimately, the landowner would go to the pipeline, the shell company that finally owns it, and say, "Pay to take this out," and they'd say, "We don't need money, sue us, go ahead." And the landowner would be stuck having to have the pipe removed themselves. And believe me, like I said, it probably costs about as much to remove a pipe from the ground as it does to put it in the first place. You go to the pipelines on your property, some of those are going to be older. They may become a problem over time. So, okay, next one. Liability, clean water access for spills. Basically, I'll translate it. States can do whatever they want for liability. So if the state wants to make it easier for you to sue TransCanada to recover your economic damages from a spill, the state can do it. And I'm not an expert in Nebraska law, I'm not licensed here, but there's certainly ways that if a landowner had to go into court against TransCanada, that the state could make it easier and put the burden on TransCanada to prove that they didn't do it, that they were not at fault, or you can just simply remove fault from it altogether. If there's a spill, TransCanada pays for all the damages regardless of who caused it. It's called strict liability. I'm not sure what Nebraska says, but there's certainly ways of making it easier for landowners rather than having to go up against TransCanada and their lawyers. And last year for Keystone 1, TransCanada's legal budget, according to their filings at FERC, was over $6 million. So they can lawyer up pretty easily. Okay, next one. Neighboring land uses. This is sort of popular and sort of not with some people, but it kind of makes sense that if you're going to have a pipeline operating, even if they get their special permit ultimately at 1,600 psi in places, or 1,500 psi, 36-inch pipeline that oil can spray hundreds of yards away. Kind of makes sense not to put a fire station right by a pipeline, or an explosives factory, or a hospital, or a nursing home. And so counties or local governments for any kind of pipeline could do an ordinance that says, there's certain kinds of uses that can't come, near that pipeline. And that's a safety ordinance, but again, the distinction is that they're regulating other people. They're not regulating the pipeline company. They're regulating neighboring land uses and saying that you can and can't do certain kinds of things. Also, you could do a requirement that in a property transfer near a pipeline, the pipeline has to be noted. I'm sure those poor people in San Bruno, where the big gas pipeline blew up and people died, would have really liked to know when they bought their houses that, hey, there's a big, huge gas pipeline that's kind of like it's buried dynamite, in your backyard. That kind of notice could be important for people. Wouldn't you all want to know if there's a pipeline, if you're buying a house and there's a pipeline in the backyard? I would. And anyway, there's a lot of different things that can be done. There's a big process called the PIPA process, and it has some ideas. And there's a group called the Pipeline Safety Trust, which is the only nonprofit in the United States dedicated to pipeline safety, and they have a lot of material on what landowners can do, or what counties and cities can do to protect our future landowners. Okay, next slide. So anyway, summary. Fed's role in pipeline regulation is limited. Fed's primary role is a building inspector. DIS process only studies impacts and cannot by itself require improvements in the project, except for in places like Montana where they have a state law that does that. Nebraska can protect its citizens where it can by doing construction permitting, routing permitting, emergency response, eminent domain, pipeline abandonment, liability, and limiting development near major pipelines. If the state isn't going to do anything, it might as well just say that, hey, we trust TransCanada more than we trust ourselves. You go to the legislature and say, I'm not going to do anything because I don't believe in regulation. Oh, so what you're saying is that you trust TransCanada to take care of the citizens of Nebraska more than you trust the state legislature or the government or the state agency to do that. So,
I have a question. We get involved with them. I mean, this permit goes through and our focus is getting it off the aquifer, but if we get that pipeline through here, I haven't seen any place where it says, we don't like you anymore, go back home. So what do we do then? Is this a lifetime commitment then? Until they're out of oil up there, or what?
If they build it, they'll keep using it.
Well, I mean, do we have any control that says you are crossing our state, our United States line? We don't like the way you've done things. Take your oil and go back to Canada. Do we have any rights there to do that?
Unfortunately, if it was built, then they'd have a lot of contractual obligations.
I don't care about them.
Yeah, I know.
care, you know.
I'm just saying that the state in theory could, but they'd have to probably pay for the pipeline at that point, once it's built. I mean, it's not good news.
But if the president, so the president can't say, now you can't, you got to go back home, we don't like you anymore. Once he says, okay, it's a done deal then.
Probably not, but you know, and there's also weird things in foreign affairs that sometimes
I
stuff
know,
can happen.
that's one of the problems we got, yes.
So, let's see. And then let's run through a few additional issues here. This is the tax records from the Keystone Line for 2010. Can you all see Nebraska here? I'll read it. Kansas, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska. $14,000 they paid in taxes in 2010. And on per state, on a per mile basis, that's $66 a mile. In Kansas, they have, I believe that's $35,000 a mile they're paying in taxes right now.
Wow.
And I'm not sure why this is. It's probably just some arcane tax rule. But I think it's worth asking your legislators. They talk about tax income, and yet, and this is out of their filings that they filed with FERC. Maybe they made a mistake. You know, maybe the little scriveners screwed up and put 14,000 to 14 million or something. I don't know. But anyway, it's worth asking about. So, next slide. And this is sort of a complicated slide, but some of you might appreciate it. And this is related to the issue of time. The dark blue line in the lower left-hand part of the solid line is the historical heavy oil production in Canada, exports. Historical exports of heavy oil in Canada. That is how much oil they export over time in Canada. And it's through 2010. Okay, and then the dotted line is what's called a linear projection. So basically you say, well, what shape is this curve, is this data? And I'm just going to, well, the linear projection fits really well. There's no evidence that this rate of production in Canada is going up or any faster or beginning to flatten out. It's just going straight, right? Okay, the black line is the lower part is the export pipeline capacity from Canada before they built the Keystone 1 and the Alberta Clipper pipelines. So that's before the brand new pipelines came online. Where it goes up, that's the addition of capacity that they made in 2009, 2010. Keystone 1 and Alberta Clipper. You can see they've doubled their pipeline export capacity already, right? They have a lot of excess capacity to bring oil out of Canada. And then the red dotted line on top is what happens when the Keystone itself comes in and how much more capacity they have, the one on the flat line. The curvy brown line is the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAP, the trade association for the Canadian oil companies. That's their forecast that justifies the Keystone XL pipeline. And I'll show you a slide in a second, but anyway, they sort of assume that things are going to suddenly get really different up there, and they're going to be able to develop really fast in Canada, right? But the thing that you can't see is, I'll just come over here, I'll yell. Where this line crosses, where the existing capacity trains to the Keystone 1 and Alberta Clipper are consumed, according to the historical projection, that's 2036. Where this line crosses is 2021. That's what they justified the Keystone XL pipeline on. And where the Keystone XL pipeline would be completely consumed is like 2056 or something. And this is where the issue of time and need is important. Okay? What this means is that they don't need this damn thing to bring oil in from Canada, and they won't for a very, very long time. if you believe the CAP forecast, so what are they there? They're the rah-rah cheerleading team for the oil industry in Canada. Why would in the world we trust them? Well, the Department of State is basing their forecasts on CAP. Is their decisions being based on foreign oil companies, trade associations, for them. And so they have a lot of excess capacity right now. So let's do the next slide. And this is CAP's grand, wonderful history of forecasts. So again, the black line down there is the historical, and all those swirly lines are what CAP said was going to happen, right? And they're all going up and up, and it's a little bit different shape, but they're all going up and up. And they've always, every single forecast they've done since they've started, which was in 2006, they've massively overestimated what the industry up there would be able to pull off. And those lines may not seem far apart, but if you look at in 2006 compared to like the most recent forecast, the big orange, the darker orange line, the difference between those two is 1 million barrels roughly, 1 million barrels per day. In other words, 5 years ago they said that last year there would be an additional 1 million barrels a day of oil coming out of Canada. That's bigger than the entire capacity of the Keystone XL pipeline. And they were wrong 5 years ago. They couldn't forecast 5 years in the future with any accuracy, right? So why are we trusting them? But this is their justification for the Keystone pipeline we needed. Next one. And why isn't fat syrup in Canada? Well, first off, this is very expensive. It's the most expensive oil in the world. I got a graphic to show you in a second. Marginal economic viability. They only can construct fast up there when oil prices are high. But you know what happens when oil prices are high? The rest of us lose money and the economy goes into recession. There's a very close relationship between higher oil prices and the economy going into recession. Because we don't have money in our pockets, it's all going to them. So, the problem they have is that they can only build a lot when oil prices are super high. Well, then that triggers recessions and the economy goes into the tank, and then they can't build very fast. So the slight waiver in that historical development during boom times, it goes up a little bit, and then during recessions it goes down a little bit, and it goes up. Does those kinds of things for the tar sands oil. And they say they need to replace that. Yeah, well, at some point maybe, but in the meantime, oil's still flowing out of those countries, and it's all kinds of cheaper than the tar sands oil, and they make all kinds more profit when they refine it. The remote location up there, it's a long way up to Alberta. It's hard to get stuff up there. And the complex technology, they have explosions and things burn and stuff breaks, and their technology doesn't work that well, and they just dick things up, and they're not perfect, they're not gods. And so if a major, piece of equipment goes offline, that can be a large amount of their capacity gone for half a year. So the bottom line here is the historical annual average in supply of tar sands oil has been 1,000 barrels per year since 2001. So every year they add 112,000 barrels to their supply. A lot of that stays in Canada to serve Canadian needs, but that's not the export, but that's the rate they can develop in Canada. To meet that orange line, the CAP forecast, they need to be making 185,000 additional barrels every year of tar sands oil. They've never done that. Well, there was 1 year a long time ago where they did 200,000 barrels a year, but this is an average. They have to average that every year. That means in some years they've got to be at 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a year of additional capacity. They've never come close to it. Next slide. Okay, this is hard for you to read too, but where the arrow's pointing up there, and in the side there, you can see the bottom is $30 per barrel, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, $100 a barrel at the top of the chart. The things that are circled up right in the corner, that's the tar sands oil. That's how much it costs to do a new project. All the other ones down there, there's the ones on the farthest left, the circle there is the traditional oil developments, down in the $50, $60 per barrel range. And the other ones, the deep water there's some Brazilian projects, and the next most highest down before the tar sands is deep water, things like the drilling in the Gulf. Pretty expensive oil, but tar sands beats them all. And there's some evidence to suggest that when oil prices get up to $90, $100 a barrel, that's the point at which people stop having faith in the economy and they stop buying stuff and start putting more money in their tanks and their oil for whatever, their heating, home heating, whatever. So, like I said, tar sands oil is marginally economical because it's costs so much to get out of the ground that oil prices have to be really high to justify it, but they're so high that the economy may not be able to afford this oil. It's just that expensive. Next one. So the question is it really necessary to burden Nebraskans with the Keystone XL pipeline? You know, they don't need more import capacity. There's so much freaking import capacity right now, they don't know what to do with it. I mean, you know, the Alberta Clipper pipeline, that whole system is running at 4% above what it was in 2007. They've got an 800,000, maximum 800,000 barrel pipeline that's not being used at all right now, essentially. The Keystone pipeline as of June, the second quarter of 2011, was running at about 55 to 57% capacity. So they've got a lot of extra capacity in the first Keystone pipeline right now too. And the question is, you know, they did the studies and the justification for the Keystone XL pipeline back in the boom times of 2006, 2007, 2008, when those charts, those squiggly lines were all going really high. And they said the Keystone XL pipeline would take care of that forecasted demand. Well, it hasn't panned out, and that forecasted demand isn't there, you know, for the pipelines. But have they reduced the size of the Keystone XL pipeline? No. Have they delayed its dates? No. You know, they're basically saying we still need this, you know, even though our forecasts, our own forecasts, have decreased by, you know, 100 million barrels a day per year. Our own forecast has decreased by more than the volume of the Keystone XL pipeline in the last 5 years, but we still need this pipeline. So, you know, they are just ramming this through because they can. And you might ask, well, isn't this a bad business decision for them? You know, if they build this and they don't get oil in it, aren't they going to go bankrupt? And the answer is, well, no. And the reason is because the federal government guarantees them that if they build these pipelines, they'll earn money on it. They may not get any much oil in the pipelines, but the federal government, through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, guarantees that they'll get a return on investment in these pipelines. There's no free market here. It's the consumer, all the costs for these extra pipelines. It's, you know, that's the average pipeline is about $5 billion. It's not being used right now. That's $5 billion of infrastructure that's not earning its keep. If this was a regular business environment, they'd go out of business. You know, if there was somebody who owned, you know, a truck rental place and they bought too many trucks and they had all their investment in trucks and nobody was renting their trucks, then they go out of business. But not pipelines, because if they can build it, FERC will guarantee that they'll make money. So it's the consumers that are taking on the risk of these pipelines being needed or not. And, you know, heaven knows that the development rates could be lower than even the historical average. It could be a major recession, you know, or have a bit of a depression. There could be some other kind of disruption, and, you know, the rates could actually be lower and the need for this pipeline to go down. So, you know, I know that everybody talks about this in certain ways, but I wanted to introduce some other ideas here, because the truth of the matter is, I think, that there's other ways of dealing with our energy needs than this pipeline. The TransCanada, a foreign oil company, and the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers are really dictating policy to the federal government about how, you know, whether this is needed or not. And as a final analogy, before I wrap up here, they say that this pipeline will bring oil. Well, that's like saying that a milk truck will bring milk. Well, if you buy a milk truck, you might get milk if there are cows and dairies and the fields to feed the cows and all the infrastructure upstream to get that milk into the milk truck. But if that infrastructure upstream doesn't exist, then you just bought a milk truck that's a monument to your own, you know, sort of stupidity and waste. You know, there's a difference between buying pipeline capacity and buying oil. They're two entirely separate things. So, you know, are they wasting the legislature's time? Are they wasting your time? Are they wasting everybody's time, the Obama administration's time, with this plan? And the reason they can do it is because they jack the federal system to such an extent that they can make a profit no matter how stupid they are. No matter how foolish they are, no matter if it makes any sense or not from a practical point of view, they can make a profit. So anyway, I think that's it. Next slide, I think. And thanks again for your caring and action. It's inspiring. You guys